Welcome to everyone who's looking in on this program. As you see from the background, Holly is with the American Jewish Committee, an organization that I personally have had the pleasure of working with over many, many years. The AJC is one of the oldest, most experienced, and most effective advocacy organizations in this country for fighting anti-Semitism and generally shoring up democratic values as much as one can. And Holly Huffnagle, who's been with the AJC first in LA, now on the East Coast, heads really a very important position. She's the director for combating anti-Semitism throughout this country. It's a large assignment, but she carries it out with great dedication, great energy, and very, very effectively. Those of us in the academic world who study anti-Semitism do our best to understand the phenomenon. We know that since the turn of the millennium, it's been on the rise. We now know a good deal about who's behind it, what drives it, even what gives it its appeal. What we don't know nearly enough of is what we can do to put checks on, to restrain it. We would all like to eliminate it entirely, but that's unlikely to happen. Hostility to Jews goes back over many, many centuries, as we know, and unfortunately it's revived in our own day. I'm sometimes asked if I enjoy the work I do, monitoring, trying to understand and then explain Jew hatred. And the answer is I don't enjoy it whatsoever. In fact, it's a misery. What I do enjoy, however, is coming into contact with people like our speaker. They don't come smarter than Holly Huffnagle, more energetic, more dedicated, more devoted, and more hands-on in her way of dealing with lots of people who can make a difference with regard to what works. That's going to be the focus of her work right now. Before introducing her finally to you, let me also say that David Harris, the longtime head of the AJC, who's worked very closely with our institute. In fact, David was the keynote speaker for a major conference we did this past summer. David will be retiring shortly. He's to be succeeded by Congressman Ted Deutsch, and we look forward to our ongoing connection to the AJC in the future as we have in the past. Holly, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Alvin, and for your very kind introduction. I hope my presentation today can live up to your introduction. And I also want to thank Gunter for both of you for inviting me today. The title of my talk is What Works? Successful Interventions to Counter Anti-Semitism. And I would be remiss if I did not start by noting that one institution that is successfully working to educate students, faculty, American leadership, citizens on the topic of anti-Semitism is the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism at Indiana University, Bloomington. It really is the only entity of its kind here in the United States with such a robust operation. So it's my honor to be here today. I am going to discuss recent interventions against anti-Semitism, primarily in the United States, and provide analysis on why they worked. Now, I realize it is much easier to talk about what is happening with the state of anti-Semitism in America, what is going wrong, than it is to talk about what's going right, to talk about its successes. It's actually much more challenging to come up with what's working. Is it even possible to measure impact in the fight against anti-Semitism? But for today's discussion, I'm going to approach this topic as a practitioner. The interventions I will share are not necessarily based in theory or academic debate, both of which, as Alvin mentioned, are critical to understanding contemporary anti-Semitism, but they're really based on practical, on-the-ground results over time. Now, these interventions are not a silver bullet, but when used properly, used together, and used continuously, we do notice a difference. And I argue that these glimpses of success, even if partial, should drive practitioners' efforts for years to come. So before we speak about what is working now, we actually must have a better understanding of how anti-Semitism and the fight against it has been understood historically in the United States. After all, when we think about it, fighting anti-Semitism is intertwined with the history of anti-Semitism itself. That's actually a future topic of discussion and debate. And I'll spend a few minutes here. So one question that practitioners grapple with today is, are we at a point right now in American history where anti-Semitism is a regular feature? And I ask this because most historians of anti-Semitism in the United States, and there actually aren't many, treat anti-Semitism as an anomaly. In fact, when we look at the historiography of domestic anti-Semitism, we see it often argued that anti-Semitism did not really exist in the United States from the 17th century when Jews first formed communities up until and after World War I. In fact, American Jewish Committee's own Harry Schneiderman, he's a Polish-born American Jewish editor and executive, he wrote about this in 1947. He wrote a 3-part paper series called Anti-Semitism in the United States. And he concluded, and I quote, "For over 2½ centuries, from 1655, the year in which the first group of Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, to 1920, anti-Semitism did not exist in the United States. That hostility that existed was sporadic, overt manifestations, but there was no agitation to deprive Jews of their rights as citizens, nor was there any attempt by any individual or group to use anti-Jewish feeling to secure supporters for any political or economic movement. On the contrary, during this period, the trend of public opinion was unmistakably liberal, and such manifestations of anti-Jewish feeling as did crop up from time to time were generally condemned. Although discrimination against Jews existed in business and in social life, Jew baiting was decidedly not respectable in those days," end quote. Now, Schneiderman was not alone in arguing that anti-Semitism was sporadic. In fact, famed immigration historians Oscar Hanlon and John Higham also note that anti-Semitism had limited significance in the United States. Other historians have noted Jewish exceptionalism in America, arguing that there was no organized anti-Jewish persecutions. Some of these sporadic examples, if you will, before World War I include the Maryland Constitution in 1776 and its quote unquote Jew bill, which stated that only Christians were allowed to hold state office in Maryland. This was not repealed until 1826, excuse me. During the Civil War, we know of Ulysses S. Grant, the order from Holly Springs, Mississippi, working to expel Jews from areas of Tennessee, from Kentucky, from Mississippi. President Abraham Lincoln did rescind that order. We know of the Saratoga Affair of 1877, where Joseph Seligman, who was one of the most prominent bankers of German Jewish background, showed up at the Grand Union Hotel in the resort town of Saratoga and was turned away because the manager supposedly told him that Israelites were no longer welcome. And we know of the case, in 1913 of Leo Frank in Atlanta, the Jewish factory manager who was accused of killing a 13-year-old Christian girl, and he was lynched after his death sentence was commuted. Now, a topic for another day is if historians should reconsider framing these individual anti-Jewish episodes as exceptional before World War I, or instead think of them as parts of a longer history and pattern. This is something actually that historian Britt Tevis has explored in her work. But going back to Schneiderman, he argues that something changed in 1920 with mass immigration to the United States, with the development of an anti-immigrant mindset, after 1920 with these new waves of immigration, with an increasing fear of communism, with the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into English and its subsequent mass distribution by Henry Ford, with increasing isolationism and nationalism in our country, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and rising economic uncertainty during and through the Depression, there was what Schneiderman called the transplanting of European anti-Semitism onto America. The transplanting of European anti-Semitism onto America, right after 1920. And Schneiderman notes, and I quote, "The new themes introduced an element of fear of Jews as sinister conspirators or wielders of inordinate power. This innovation," he's calling it an innovation, "was an indication of the fact that Jews had become conspicuous in the economic life of the country and that the success of them was beginning to arouse resentment, as if they were, quote unquote, alien intruders who had no right to share in the country's prosperity," end quote. And it was really this period starting after World War I until the mid-1930s, where anti-Semitism in the United States seemed to develop a certain regularity. Now, one would think that the interventions to fight anti-Semitism, that this is the what worked, what's successful, would have also increased in parallel at this time. Yet when we look at the interventions during this period, Schneiderman argues, and I quote, "The Jewish community continued, as in the past, to deal only with the symptoms of existing anti-Jewish prejudice, and action was only taken when emergencies arose," end quote. But during the late 1930s, 1940s, and in the immediacy after World War II, there is evidence of sustained anti-Semitism in America. American Jews, we know, face discrimination in employment, including law firms, housing, membership in certain clubs and resorts, acceptance into certain colleges, medical schools due to Jewish quotas. And here we have various methods and interventions used to challenge anti-Semitism, from public debate, from legislative advocacy, written articles, even monitoring the activities of anti-Semites, raiding Nazi meetings in our country, demonstrations. So these interventions all of a sudden started to become more regular. And because of these efforts, especially after the reality of the Holocaust came to light, anti-Semitism, at least in polite, normal society, was no longer acceptable. And we actually see the levels of anti-Semitism in the United States go down. But where are we now? And that's the question we ask ourselves as practitioners. Where are we now? We know in the 1960s, 1970s, there was less anti-Semitism in our country, but what's really happened in the last 5, if not 10 years? We're experiencing a period, are we experiencing a period in US history? And it's hard to say because we're in it right now. No one's looking back 20 years from now and looking at our time, but are we experiencing regular anti-Semitism again? Is it become normal? And are the interventions, the fight against it, regular as well? Like, are we meeting the current rise with our interventions? And I do believe that reinvigorated anti-Semitism has become a regular feature in the United States, especially with social media over the last few years. And recently, we conducted interviews of American Jews, and their stories reflect this. And for example, I want to share a few quotes from interviews that we did with several American Jews in New York a few months ago, last December. And one interviewee shared, and this is a quote, I like to wear a hat, not a kippah, on the street. It's simply saying that I don't necessarily want to suffer through another verbal assault," end quote. Another said, and I quote, "It's harder to think about wanting to wear a star," end quote. And another, and this one's a little bit longer, revealed, and I quote, "Well, I wear a kippah. That's a target and an invitation, it seems, for people to comment. Sometimes kind remarks, and sometimes obnoxious, hateful, and anti-Semitic remarks. I'm on the subway coming home. I'm walking with my daughter, and I'm called the effing Jew who doesn't have a place here, the effing Jew who doesn't belong," things like that. "My father stepped out of a performance where he was conducting and was called an anti-Semitic slur by a car passing by," end quote. Now, these short anecdotes are snapshots of a larger problem, not only in New York, but in the United States. And even though America has been comparably a very good place for Jews, anti-Semitism has become more violent and more open in recent years. And in 2020, Jews were the target of 55% of all religiously motivated hate crimes, according to the FBI, despite being 2% of the American population. And fatal attacks against the Jewish community have occurred with horrifying frequency in recent years. So there, maybe going back to Charlottesville, but we can at least look to the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the murderous attack at a Chabad in Poway in California, a shooting at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, a stabbing at a Hanukkah party in Muncie, New York. In May of 2021, the US experienced at least an 80% increase, if not up to 120% increase in anti-Semitism during the conflict between Israel and Hamas. This past July, there was a rabbi who was stabbed multiple times outside of a Jewish school in Boston. And in January of this year, 4 American Jews were held hostage in a synagogue in Texas. And this is not to mention the ongoing physical attacks against Jews on the streets of Brooklyn. In the past couple of months alone in the United States, we have recorded neo-Nazis publicly gathering, Jewish businesses and synagogues have been defaced, Jews, including Jewish children, have been beaten up and spat on in New York. The Holocaust has been trivialized and distorted by prominent politicians and other civic leaders. Anti-Jewish flyers have been left on driveways and in mailboxes in a multi-state coordinated harassment campaign, and the list goes on. So given this seeming regularity of the problem and the agreement among practitioners and most scholars and corroborated by the FBI that anti-Semitism is increasing, or at least it's becoming more visible in our time in the United States in the last few years, what interventions are working? And I'm going to focus just on the last few years. Of course, I think we would be remiss if we don't remember the successful interventions of the past, from getting Henry Ford to apologize and retract the Dearborn Independent articles to the success of the Soviet Jewry movement. These are, incredible interventions, but I'm going to focus on what's happened in the last 5 years. And what is going to differentiate the interventions I'm about to share is that they need to be sustained efforts. These aren't one-offs, they really need to be sustained. And I have 5 successful interventions that I'd like to share with you now. The first successful intervention, and a lot of these are actually in process. They're happening in real time. But the first one is, and some of them, they might even seem simple, but I'll explain how they are successful. So the first successful intervention in the fight against anti-Semitism has been better data. Now, to date, there still is not, in the United States, there is really not a comprehensive study that looks at altogether anti-Semitic attitudes, sources of anti-Semitism and root causes, and then American Jews' experiences with anti-Semitism in one place. That does not exist, but we do have small starts. And for instance, following the publication of American Jewish Committee's report on the state of anti-Semitism in America, which revealed that 90% of American Jews think anti-Semitism is a problem in the US, and 80% think it's increased in the last 5 years. That data is what helped mobilize a coalition of over 700 US mayors, which represented over 100 million Americans from every US state, and including the District of Columbia, to actually sign on to a statement condemning anti-Semitism, including denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination and or the Jewish state's right to exist. That was a line in the statement. The data is also the data that showed that 1 in 4 Americans, Jews, experienced or were personally targeted by anti-Semitism this past year, and that 4 in 10, almost 40%, have changed their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism this past year. And then combined with the FBI statistics that again show that Jews are the most targeted group for religious bias hate crimes. That is the data that has led 2 EEOC commissioners to ensure that anti-Semitism is now properly addressed in the American workplace. We're finding that data is also beginning to help the media more accurately report on anti-Semitism. So for instance, last May, during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, Americans were largely unaware of this 80 to 120% increase in our country. Even Americans who watch the news regularly, they were not aware that Jews were being attacked on the streets in New York or in Los Angeles. So we found in our data collection, while 71% of American Jews had heard a lot or something about Jews being attacked in the US and around the world. And for 72% of them, it actually made them feel less safe as a Jewish person in our country. Only 11% of US adults had heard a lot, and 37% had heard something. So we're using this data, this discrepancy in awareness to bring to journalists and help train them to recognize all forms of anti-Semitism so that they can, accurately inform society and keep our leaders accountable. And it's also this data, the data that showed that anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses have tripled in the last 10 years, reported incidents have tripled, and that 50% of Jewish college students have experienced or witnessed an anti-Semitic incident within the past year. That data, that is what's bringing over 40 university presidents to convene at the first of its kind major summit in New York City this month, solely on combating anti-Semitism on campus. So 40 university presidents from around the United States are gathering together with their DEI officers in New York to talk about how do we make changes on campus. But it was the data, it started with the data to bring them to that place. So that's the first successful intervention, again, in process. A second successful intervention has been advocacy at the state, local, and federal levels. Now, this does not always bring success. We are very aware of that as an advocacy organization. We have many failures, but I want to mention three that I'm really excited about. For more than 2 decades, under the 1990 Hate Crime Statistics Act, local, state, tribal, federal law enforcement agencies have voluntarily submitted hate crimes data to the FBI. Now, as incidents of hate crimes have risen, inaccurate, incomplete, simply absent hate crimes reporting has actually stymied efforts to fully comprehend and formulate effective responses. I think last year there were over 60 cities that had over 100,000 residents that did not report any hate crimes, reported 0 hate crimes. And this includes Miami, Grand Rapids, Syracuse, New York, Anaheim, reported 0 hate crimes. So something needed to change. And the 2021 passage of the Khalid Jabara Heather Hire No Hate Act, which links hate crime reporting to Department of Justice grants and other resources to better hate crimes prevention, encourage data collection and reporting, was an incredibly successful intervention. And it was one that was done by a broad coalition of civil society partners, including Asian American and Muslim American communities. Once these resources will be made available, law enforcement agencies across the country will be able to access hate crimes bias training. They'll be able to establish and expand the use of hate crimes hotlines. So if you witness a hate crime, you'll know what to do. It's easier to report, for them to record it, and then for them the law enforcement agency to provide that information to the FBI. They'll be trained to more accurately report on hate crimes, including how to better classify anti-Semitic hate crimes. That's all part of this legislation, of this advocacy effort. A second example of a successful intervention in the advocacy space was advocating for a point person in government to be responsible for combating anti-Semitism in their country. And for this success, we're going to leave the United States and go to Europe. And it's really started in Europe in around 2014 or so, given the steep rise in anti-Semitism, especially in Western Europe. Advocating for a point person, someone to be in charge in the government that would just look at anti-Semitism issues. Now, not only, so this is where the success comes in, not only does the European Union have a point person today, the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Antisemitism and Fostering Jewish Life, this is Katharina von Schnurbein, but upwards of 10 other EU member states have individuals whose sole task is to combat anti-Semitism in their country. Germany, for instance, not only has someone at the federal level, Felix Klein, but there is someone for each of the 16 states in Germany. The Belfer Institute for Latino and Latin American Affairs at AJC, it's our Latino branch, worked to establish this position within the Organization of American States, the OAS. And in fact, it was a Belfer Institute board member, Fernando Lautenberg, who I know was featured on a previous webinar here, was appointed as its first commissioner. So these positions are incredibly successful interventions on behalf of organizations advocating for their creation. And what's so incredible now is that many of these coordinators are working with their governments to develop national action plans these whole of government approaches to fight anti-Semitism and to promote Jewish life in their countries. Now, in the United States, while violent anti-Semitism, I think, is jeopardizing Jewish security across our country, we don't have a unified, national plan to address the problem. And a current intervention, it's not yet successful, so I mention it with a disclaimer, is a current ask out right now to the White House to convene a task force charged with creating a national action plan that would build infrastructure around combating anti-Semitism, including establishing a regular process of sharing federal government efforts with each other. So right now, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, they all have, different responsibilities vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, but they're not necessarily sharing that with each other. So this plan would coordinate federal agency efforts, but it would also streamline sharing those efforts with the Jewish community. And the plan would also have a funding mechanism to ensure the sustained security, educational, training needs are met across the United States. This doesn't currently exist. This is an intervention that is in process, but I want to share what we envision success looking like. And then the third and final advocacy success I want to mention is the working definition of anti-Semitism has really been a successful advocacy intervention. Of course, it has its detractors. I think any successful tool will, but worldwide recognition of the definition is nothing short of remarkable. So the working definition of anti-Semitism was developed in the early 2000s and out of a real need to explain all forms of anti-Semitism, given a resurgence in Europe. And with some changes, it was adopted in a new form in 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This is the IRA. And to date, almost 900 bodies, including more than 30 countries, have endorsed what is now known as the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And it's a working definition, meaning it's meant to go to work. It's meant to be employed. It's a flexible tool that's used by government, that's used by law enforcement agencies that have a real life need to identify anti-Semitism. And we've seen real success in that area. Now, on this, maybe this last note, but speaking about advocacy interventions, I should note failed interventions, at least. I would be remiss if I didn't. Advocacy interventions have failed for many reasons, but one is when anti-Semitism or the fight against it has become a weapon in partisan politics. And we saw this failing in the US Congress with the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. It became a real wedge issue, unfortunately, between Republicans and Democrats. And we've also seen it with failed endorsements of the IRA working definition. The city, like for instance, city of Chicago, like you see politics start dividing and coming against, the fight, a real fight against anti-Semitism. So there are failed interventions in this space, and I would be remiss if I don't share the failures as well. The third successful intervention is on social media. Now, I hesitate to even say there's a successful intervention on social media, but because I know there's actually a lot of failures as well. And I think we are all so aware of the anti-Semitic content that is just accessible to young, impressionable minds. We know of the content that radicalized the perpetrators in Pittsburgh and Poway and Muncie and Colleyville, but there have been some successes, and I want to share. Well, here's one to start. Just 5, maybe 7 years ago, probably about 7 years ago now, major tech companies were still taking an absolutist position, and they had been for years, that their platforms were open marketplaces of ideas, and it wasn't their responsibility to intervene. But their hope was that the best ideas would rise to the surface in this marketplace of ideas. They realized it wasn't working. Instead, their platforms had nurtured violence, had nurtured extremism. And amid this realization and national outcry, social media giants began to expand their definitions of hate speech and began to moderate content and take it down. This wasn't that long ago that this change happened. And we know, for instance, when Twitter finally suspended ISIS accounts, the Islamic State's ability to develop and maintain robust and influential online communities was severely affected. We forget that just 7-8 years ago, ISIS at its peak had 70,000 Twitter accounts in over 12 languages, and it was allowed. Since then, Facebook has decided, albeit imperfectly, to remove pages which promote violent white nationalism. Reddit rewrote its terms of service to effectively outlaw neo-Nazi and alt-right communities. White supremacists even found themselves banned from Airbnb and OkCupid. On October 12, 2020, Facebook announced that it would prohibit any content that denies or distorts the Holocaust, citing concerns about the well-documented rise in anti-Semitism globally and the alarming level of ignorance about the Holocaust, especially among young people. TikTok also announced that it would prohibit posts containing Holocaust denial and distortion. And then we see a proactive element in some of these spaces. In January 2021, Facebook announced that it would begin directing people who search for Holocaust denial to accurate Holocaust education resources. And TikTok did the same thing this past February. And just several months ago, American Jewish Committee, we conducted a training on anti-Semitism for one of the tech companies that included a robust discussion of Zionism and anti-Zionism to the company's full-time trust and safety employees, the team leads, the extended global team that moderates content around the world. And again, although this is far from perfect, this is a massive industry shift. And it really is a successful intervention on behalf of civil society. There's a long way to go, but the change is a successful intervention. Now, one of my responsibilities at American Jewish Committee is to liaise with Meta, so Facebook and Instagram, with Twitter, TikTok, Google, Clubhouse, which is an audio only app, and a current intervention that we're doing right now. So again, I'm mentioning one that's not been successful yet, but is encouraging tech companies to hire a point person focused on the Jewish diaspora to both listen to the concerns of Jewish communities around the world and then work with senior leadership within the company so structural changes can happen, which would ensure that anti-Semitism is understood, recognized, and properly addressed. And I should add, before the policies are written about anti-Semitism. Currently, only Facebook has someone in this role. No other company has someone that is working with the Jewish diaspora and then bringing those concerns to the company itself. So we're asking companies for that. We're also asking tech companies to assign user researchers, something called user researchers, to the Jewish community to better understand how Jewish users experience anti-Semitism and hate on that platform, so proper changes can be made. So that's some success in the online space. A fourth successful intervention has been training on anti-Semitism within diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. There's sometimes different acronyms for it, but within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, both within corporate America and on college campuses, especially as we continue to see that one of the leading causes of anti-Semitism today is often ignorance of what it is, what it looks like, including the double standards that Jews face, especially in progressive spaces. So many Americans in leadership positions, especially in corporate America or on college campuses, continue to view anti-Semitism through a religious lens, and therefore a topic that does not need to be addressed within DEI. But it does. And what we have found as we are engaging with public and private companies, with university administrations, is that people don't know who Jews are, so they actually don't know what anti-Semitism is. And we actually need to start by explaining who Jews are. And that's what we're doing when we have DEI trainings. We've been doing trainings for global companies, global firms, and we start by sharing that Jews are a people. The majority practice Judaism, or at least culturally associated with Jewish traditions, but others are not. Many Jews are atheists. They're not religious, but they're still Jews. We share in corporate DEI trainings that the word Jew comes from the word Judea, the ancient name for Israel. We expand on Jewish diversity, and we note that European Ashkenazi Jews, but there are Black Jews from Ethiopia, brown Jews from India, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and Turkey, and from Iraq and Iran. And we show how presuming that Jews are quote unquote white and therefore privileged has actually led to anti-Semitism being overlooked. we share that there is nothing progressive about ending Jewish liberation. There's nothing progressive about erasing Jews from narratives. There's nothing progressive about dismissing their ingenuity to the land of Israel. And we work with HR departments, with human resources departments, to help them understand hostile work environments for Jews, which can be connected to Israel, such as when Jewish employees are asked to condemn Israel or explain Israeli actions because they are Jewish. You know, when Chinese employees or Chinese American employees are not asked to defend China's action with the Uyghurs or any other worldwide event, but there's something about the Jewish employees that there's this kind of double standard that they're facing. And we reveal that in these trainings. And we also show how anti-Semitism works, which many people don't know how anti-Semitism works. They don't know that it's not linear. It really does ebb and flow through this very long history. And that just because Jews may be in comfortable positions or assimilated today, we know from history that that is not a guarantee for safety. And then finally, in our trainings, we also do define anti-Semitism by showing that it's not just a hatred. Again, many people will think it's just a hatred towards Jews. So we have to take extra effort to show the conspiratorial side of anti-Semitism. We had an opportunity to do so 1 week after the hostage situation in Colleyville. We already had it on the books to do a training for the FBI, the Civil Rights Division of the FBI, and we had to discuss at length conspiratorial anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews are this someone in power or control. And we know the perpetrator in Colleyville said that, and I quote, President Biden will do things for the Jews. And that's why the synagogue, which was closest to the location where Afia Siddiqui was held, was chosen for the site of the attack. The attack was actually integrally connected to the Jewish community from the beginning, even though the FBI first stated otherwise. And I think that incident was a real wake-up call for how the FBI sees anti-Semitism, how it needs to classify it in the future as more than just a religious bias, which is how it's currently classified now by the FBI. And following these trainings, we received reports back of real change. So policies being updated, anti-Semitism being added into DEI curricula, law enforcement at least acknowledging the need to better understand the complexity of the problem, the media sharing they now know how to report, or at least where to start, for instance, when the culprit of an anti-Semitic attack doesn't come from a white supremacist. And these interventions, which again, still need a lot of development, have been quite successful, and they're very recent. This is really just in the last year that some of these trainings and bringing anti-Semitism into DEI have really taken off. The fifth and final intervention that I want to share that has success, and this is not a new one, is human relationships and coalition building. So we know that we can't just change people's minds by just the trainings, by giving them facts and new information. People really change when they meet new people, when they're in new environments. The social psychologist Gordon Allport, he wrote about this decades ago in what he called the contact hypothesis, that doing life together with people of other groups actually can reduce prejudice and change minds. So this is why, in part, our interventions have included helping launch the Senate caucus on Black-Jewish relations. It's why we now have an office in Abu Dhabi. It's the first American Jewish committee office in an Arab country to further build those relationships and coalitions in the Arab world. It's even why the organization Rent a Jew, which is maybe not the best translation into English, but exists in Germany. So Germans, the majority of whom have never met someone who is Jewish, can meet members of the Jewish community in their town, at their library, at their schools, and reduce prejudice and stereotypes by interacting with them. So this is a form of experiential learning, which is another successful intervention in this space. For example, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we brought the most senior delegation of Muslim leaders to tour the site, and it resulted actually in the Secretary General of the Mecca-based Muslim World League acknowledging for the first time that the Holocaust was a heinous crime against Jews. And that statement attracted tremendous media attention and coverage in the Muslim world, not to mention in America, Europe, and Israel. And another example of experiential learning in this human relation building component, this intervention, are bringing delegations to Israel. And I know a lot of organizations bring leaders to Israel. We do this as well. We have something called Project Interchange. But when delegations from European diplomats to mayors, to university presidents, to influencers, to social media influencers, when they travel to Israel and they come back, they have such a more complex and nuanced understanding of the reality on the ground, and they can see the connections between how anti-Zionism is often a mask for anti-Semitism. But it took that experiential learning piece for that change to happen. Now, people also change or accept new information when it comes from someone they trust, someone they like, someone using language that they understand. And that actually might not always be us. It might not be the American Jewish Committee, it might not be Jewish organizations, it might not be the Jewish community. And so this is actually why it's so critical to work with non-Jewish allies and call on non-Jewish voices to explain what anti-Semitism is and why it's a societal problem. So successful interventions, we have found that when white, conservative, evangelical leaders disavow white nationalism, when they disavow anti-Semitic conspiracies like QAnon, or when Black political leaders call out Farrakhan's anti-Semitism, or when Muslim leaders and imams decry Islamist extremism, those interventions are actually much more successful than if American Jewish Committee was just to come to those congregations or to those communities and share, what we believe. And one story that I want to share, this is during my tenure at the State Department's Office of Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism, which I should note Deborah Lipstadt has finally been confirmed in this role, and she'll be starting very soon. But this was a previous iteration of the office, and we were visiting a country in the Middle East, and the special envoy, who was Jewish, was explaining to the Minister of Education, who was a practicing Muslim, why the anti-Semitic content on schools' websites needed to be removed. And the minister got very defensive and denied the anti-Semitism. But when the State Department's special representative to Muslim communities, who was with us and who was Muslim, stepped in and explained the anti-Semitism and then said this, as a Muslim, this needs to come down. The tone of the conversation changed, and the anti-Semitic content was eventually removed, actually, from the web pages. So talk about a non-Jewish voice successfully intervening on behalf of the Jewish community. We've also seen huge successes in Indonesia with cross-cultural religious literacy. Most Indonesians have never met someone who's Jewish. They only know about Jews through anti-Israel propaganda, through conspiracies pulled out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So we are currently providing material to partner organizations on the ground to give a full and accurate picture of Jews and Judaism. And studies and evaluations are already showing that it's directly impacting their views on it of Jews, but like lowering levels of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic thought as well. The last point I want to make on human relationships and coalition building is that they may be at their best when they happen within the Jewish community. So for instance, there was a campaign called Shine a Light, which was a national initiative among predominantly Jewish organizations, but some non-Jewish organizations as well, during the week of Hanukkah. And it really showed the power of collective action. The next month after that initiative, there were 10 US states that adopted the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism after that initiative of all the Jewish organizations coming together, which I know is not necessarily an easy thing to happen. And on this last piece of the Jewish community itself, I think something we've found at American Jewish Committee, and others have noted it as well, is that being proudly Jewish may just be one of the best interventions of all. And I want to return to the interviews that I had shared earlier of a few American Jews that we interviewed, because they did not all end on an upsetting note. In fact, they all spoke very powerfully about the importance of asserting proudly one's Jewish identity in order to combat anti-Semitism. So here are the responses. The person who said that it's harder to think about wanting to wear a star concluded by sharing, I personally do, because I want to be that opposite. I want to be the person who's proud of my heritage, end quote. Another said, quote, we need to stand strong and we can't be afraid of what might happen if we do show our Jewishness, end quote. And one interviewee whose father advised him to wear a hat when in public to cover his yarmulke bowed, like in the video interview, to display his colorful yarmulke on his head and exclaimed, and I quote, usually I like to wear that one on the street. I want other Jews to see me, to see there's another Jew standing over there, end quote. So rebuilding human relationships and coalitions like within the Jewish community and then allying with other communities has been incredibly important in the fight against anti-Semitism, especially in recent years. So I want to bring this to a conclusion, and I do want to get to a point where we can have a discussion about some of these interventions, what's working, what's not. But to conclude, it's actually quite wonderful, quite powerful to talk about the successes. I know for many of us in this work, it can be easy to look at the fight against anti-Semitism as a glass half empty that is losing water as we speak. But I firmly believe that at least these 5 pillars, these 5 interventions, again, while not a comprehensive list, there are many others I could have chosen, but they are a start. And the more interventions that we draw from better data, from government advocacy, from tech company engagement, from DEI anti-Semitism trainings, and from coalitions and building coalitions, that's the 5th, will be absolutely necessary as we think about the future, of anti-Semitism and the future of combating it. So at this point, I would like to end my formal remarks, and I look forward to your questions and comments, especially if you have other examples of what has worked or what hasn't, coming from your own experience. I welcome the opportunity to hear from you as well. So thank you, and Gunter or Alvin, I'll turn the floor back to you now.